Hey guys, tonight we're taking a deep dive into a topic that might just make you want to take a long, hot shower immediately afterward. We're going to step very carefully into the truly grimy, often malodorous world of medieval hygiene. Imagine, if you will, waking up in an unheated room, the air thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, stale straw, and something indefinably organic. You reach for a piece of clothing that hasn't seen water in weeks, if ever, and you can practically feel the accumulated layers of yesterday's dust and sweat clinging to it. Yeah, you probably won't survive this era for more than a few days without wishing for a time machine and a bottle of hand sanitizer. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing, or perhaps just existing, in a medieval town, and the first thing that truly assails your senses isn't the charming cobblestones or the quaint timber-framed houses. Oh no, it's the smell. It's a complex, multi-layered aroma that modern noses, accustomed to daily showers, deodorants, and air fresheners, would find utterly overwhelming. Think of it as a symphony of stenches. Unwashed bodies, animal waste, rotting food scraps, stagnant water, and the ever-present, acrid tang of wood smoke. This wasn't just a fleeting scent. It was the very atmosphere you breathed, day in and day out. A constant, low-level assault on your olfactory system. You'd wake up to it, eat with it, go to sleep with it. Your clothes, your hair, your very skin would absorb it, becoming part of the pervasive, earthy, and frankly, quite disgusting bouquet of the age. Let's start with the most basic concept of personal cleanliness: bathing. Today, you probably step into a hot shower or a relaxing bath every day, or at least every other day. You scrub, you lather, you rinse, and you emerge feeling fresh and clean. In the medieval period, this ritual was a rare luxury, largely misunderstood, and often viewed with a degree of suspicion. Water was a precious commodity, not always readily available in large quantities, and certainly not heated for casual use. Hauling water from a well or river was backbreaking work, and heating it over a fire was time-consuming and expensive, consuming valuable firewood. So, a full-body bath was an event, not a routine. For the vast majority of people, from the lowliest peasant to the most esteemed lord, a bath might occur only a few times a year, perhaps for specific religious holidays, before a wedding, or if you were genuinely ill and someone thought it might help. Imagine going an entire season or even a year without a proper soak. You can almost feel the layers of grime accumulating, the skin feeling perpetually sticky, the hair becoming matted and greasy. When bathing did occur, it was often a communal affair. Public bathhouses existed in some larger towns and cities, a legacy of Roman times, but their popularity waxed and waned. Sometimes they were places for genuine cleansing, but often they devolved into social hubs, even places of illicit activity, which eventually led to their decline in many areas due to moral and public health concerns. You might share a large tub with several other people, the water growing increasingly murky with each new bather. It makes you wonder how much actual cleaning was achieved, or if it was more about the social interaction and the fleeting sensation of warmth. It's a far cry from your pristine private bathroom, isn't it? Perhaps it was just a medieval version of going to the spa, less about cleanliness, more about the experience. Beyond the full bath, daily hygiene was limited to what was called a dry wash. You might wipe down your face and hands with a damp cloth, or simply rub yourself vigorously with a dry one. Sometimes, people would use fine sand or ash to try and absorb grease from their skin or hair, a sort of medieval dry shampoo, though probably far less effective and certainly more abrasive than anything you'd find in your bathroom cabinet. Think of the texture of your skin after a week of camping without access to water. Then multiply that by 100 and add a layer of soot. It was a constant battle against the buildup of dirt, sweat, and the general dust and grime of daily life in an unpaved, often muddy, and perpetually smoky environment. The concept of personal space and privacy, as we understand it, was largely non-existent. People lived in close quarters, often sharing beds, eating from common dishes, and working shoulder to shoulder. This intimacy, combined with the lack of personal hygiene, meant that any skin ailment, any infestation, any illness spread like wildfire. You might wake up with an itch, scratch it, and by evening half the household would be scratching too. Scabies, lice, fleas, these weren't just nuisances. They were constant companions, an undeniable part of daily life. Your hair, in particular, was a haven for these tiny, unwelcome guests. Washing hair was even less frequent than body bathing, and often involved harsh lye soaps or simply water, if anything at all. You can imagine the tangled, greasy mess, often matted with dirt and ripe for infestation. People would comb their hair with fine-toothed combs, not just for styling, but specifically to try and dislodge lice and nits. It was a tedious, never-ending task, like trying to empty a bucket with a spoon when the tap is still running. And then there was oral hygiene, or the tragic lack thereof. Imagine a world without toothbrushes, toothpaste, or regular dental checkups. Most people's diets were coarse, consisting of grains, root vegetables, and often very little sugar, which might have spared them from some cavities, but certainly not from other issues. Decay, gum disease, and chronic bad breath were the norm. People might chew on herbs like mint or parsley to try and freshen their breath, or rub their teeth with rough cloths or even sticks. Some might use a concoction of wine and herbs as a mouthwash, but the underlying problems of plaque buildup and infection remained. You'd likely be missing several teeth by your 20s, and the ones you had would be stained, rotten, and probably causing you immense pain. The smell of someone's breath would be a constant, close-up reminder of their decaying oral health. It really makes you appreciate that minty fresh feeling after you brush, doesn't it? Clothing, too, played a significant role in the overall grimy picture. Clothes were expensive and time-consuming to make, so people owned very few garments, often just one or two sets. These were worn day in and day out, for weeks or even months without being properly washed. Outer garments, particularly, were rarely laundered. They accumulated layers of sweat, dirt, dust, and whatever else you encountered during your daily activities. You can almost feel the stiff, heavy fabric, impregnated with the essence of its wearer and their environment. Undergarments, worn closest to the skin, might be washed slightly more often, perhaps once every few weeks, by beating them in a river or a tub with lye soap. But even then, they would quickly reabsorb the body's oils and sweat. Imagine wearing the same shirt for a month straight, never taking it off. It would cease to be just clothing. It would become a second skin, a repository of all your daily grime. Mainstream historical fact: for many, the concept of a clean shirt was more about it having been aired out or beaten, rather than truly washed with water and soap. The domestic environment itself was a contributor to the overall lack of hygiene. Homes were often dark, poorly ventilated, and shared with animals, both intentional, livestock, and unintentional, rats, mice, insects. Straw or rushes were often strewn on floors, providing some insulation and absorbing spills, but they were rarely changed. They would accumulate food scraps, animal droppings, and human waste if people relieved themselves indoors, becoming a breeding ground for pests and a source of foul odors. Imagine walking barefoot across a floor that hasn't been cleaned in months, if ever, feeling the crunch of dried refuse beneath your feet. It's a stark contrast to your vacuumed, mopped, and sanitized floors. Waste disposal was another major issue. There was no organized municipal waste collection as we know it. Human and animal waste was often simply thrown into the streets or into open cesspits. These open sewers and overflowing latrines created a perpetual stench and attracted swarms of flies and other vermin. Rain would wash some of the filth into rivers, which were also often sources of drinking water, creating a vicious cycle of contamination and disease. It's truly a wonder that anyone survived to adulthood. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rates were primarily due to poor nutrition, lack of medical knowledge, or simply the overwhelming unsanitary conditions that facilitated the spread of every imaginable pathogen. The general approach to cleanliness was less about sterility and more about managing the inevitable. People understood that filth was a problem, but their methods were rudimentary at best. They would sweep, they would air things out, They would use strong-smelling herbs and flowers to try and mask odors, but they lacked the scientific understanding of germ theory or the resources for widespread sanitation. It was a world where you were always just a little bit dirty, no matter how hard you tried. There was a quirky tidbit about medieval beliefs that too much bathing could actually be harmful, weakening the body or opening pores to disease, which might have contributed to the infrequent bathing habits. So, for many, being perpetually grimy was seen as a necessary evil, or even a healthier state, compared to the perceived risks of overwashing. It's almost like they were saying, a little dirt never hurt anyone. Much. This constant battle against filth and disease shaped daily life in profound ways. It affected comfort, health, and even social interactions. Everyone was in the same boat, so to speak, sharing the same pervasive odors and the same struggles with pests and infections. It wasn't just a matter of personal choice. It was the reality of the era, dictated by limited resources, nascent scientific understanding, and a very different perception of what constituted clean. You weren't just dealing with your own hygiene, but the hygiene, or lack thereof, of everyone and everything around you. It was a truly immersive, albeit unpleasant, sensory experience. Now that we've painted that rather aromatic backdrop of medieval life, let's narrow our focus, shall we? Imagine, if you will, stepping out of your rather drafty, presumably straw-filled bed, and right into the thick, bustling, and often quite pungent atmosphere of a medieval city. We're not talking about the manicured gardens of a lord's estate here, or the quiet, orderly cloisters of a monastery. Oh no, we're plunging headfirst into the very heart of the urban sprawl, the teeming, breathing, and sometimes quite literally smelly reality that shaped the daily lives of medieval prostitutes. You see, for these women, the environment wasn't just a backdrop. It was an active participant in their existence, dictating everything from their health to their social standing. Picture this: narrow, winding streets, often unpaved, where mud and refuse mingled freely with animal droppings and the occasional discarded chamber pot. The air, a thick stew of wood smoke, unwashed humanity, and the omnipresent tang of waste, would cling to your clothes, your hair, your very skin. Forget your modern air purifiers or even just a good cross breeze. Ventilation was a foreign concept, and the prevailing scent profile was, shall we say, robust. These were cities where waste management was less a system and more a hopeful suggestion. Open gutters flowed with, well, let's just call it gray water and leave it at that, eventually spilling into rivers that also served as drinking water sources. It was a charming cycle, really, and in this incredibly dense, often chaotic urban tapestry, prostitutes typically occupied the fringes, both geographically and socially. They weren't usually found in the grand market squares or among the respectable merchant guilds. Instead, their lives unfolded in specific, often less desirable quarters, sometimes officially designated as stews, a rather apt term, don't you think, considering the conditions? Or simply clustered around the more transient, less scrutinized areas like port districts, bustling inns, or the grittier outskirts of town. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a perpetually crowded, slightly seedy bus terminal, but with more livestock and less predictable plumbing. The spaces they inhabited were rarely glamorous. Imagine small, cramped rooms, often shared with multiple other women, perhaps a family, or even a motley collection of stray animals seeking warmth. Light was a luxury, filtering in grudgingly through small, unglazed windows, if they existed at all. Privacy, a whimsical dream, a concept yet to be invented. These were places where the sounds of the street, the hawkers' cries, the clatter of hooves, the endless human chatter, bled through thin walls, becoming the constant soundtrack to their lives. And the smells, of course, were inescapable. The damp earth, stale sweat, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present, cloying scent of desperation mingled with cheap perfume. It was a truly immersive experience, whether you wanted it or not. Now, let's talk about the social stigma, because this wasn't just about living in a less-than-ideal apartment. This was about being marked, set apart, even ostracized by the very society that, ironically, often relied on their services. Prostitutes occupied a deeply paradoxical position in medieval society. On the one hand, they were viewed as morally corrupt, sinful, and a source of spiritual contamination. The church, with its immense influence, preached damnation for those who engaged in such fleshly sins, and women who chose or were forced into this profession were often seen as beyond redemption. Their very presence was considered an affront to piety and order. Yet, here's the kicker: many medieval cities, recognizing the inevitability of human desires and perhaps the practical need to control public disorder, actually regulated prostitution. This is our mainstream historical fact for today. Many medieval cities had officially sanctioned brothels, often called stews or bordellos, which were licensed, taxed, and sometimes even run by the city authorities themselves. It was a fascinating, if hypocritical, arrangement. On one hand, you're a pariah, but on the other, you're a source of municipal revenue. It's like being told you're inherently bad, but also being handed a tax form. Talk about mixed messages. This regulation, however, came with its own set of stigmas. Prostitutes were often subject to strict sumptuary laws, dictating what they could and could not wear. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. In some cities, prostitutes were compelled to wear specific distinguishing garments, like a striped hood, a particular color cloak, or even bells, to mark them out from respectable women. Imagine trying to blend in when your outfit literally screams, "Hey, I'm a prostitute." It was designed not just for identification, but for public shaming, a constant visual reminder of their outcast status. It was the medieval equivalent of a scarlet letter, but perhaps a bit more fashion-forward in its own peculiar way. Oh, is that a new striped hood? Very distinguishing. This forced public identification meant they were excluded from many aspects of mainstream life. They couldn't join guilds, hold public office, or even attend certain religious services. Their children, if they had any, often faced the same social handicaps. They were, in essence, a necessary evil, tolerated for the greater good of preserving the virtue of other women, or perhaps preventing men from committing even worse sins like rape or sodomy, but never truly accepted. It's a bit like saying, "We need you, but please, for the love of all that is holy, don't sit too close." The psychological toll of this constant marginalization must have been immense. Imagine living in a society where you are simultaneously exploited, condemned, and legally tolerated, but never truly valued as a human being. Where every interaction, every glance, reinforces your perceived moral depravity. It bred a profound sense of isolation and, for many, despair. The sheer lack of social safety nets meant that once a woman entered this profession, escaping it was incredibly difficult, if not impossible. With no family support, no respectable employment opportunities, and a tarnished reputation, their options were virtually non-existent. It was a vicious cycle, trapping them in a life that offered little dignity and even less hope for upward mobility. Historians still argue whether the women who entered this profession did so solely out of destitution, or if some found a perverse kind of independence within its confines. While poverty and lack of alternatives were undoubtedly the primary drivers for most, the idea that some might have chosen it over, say, a restrictive marriage or backbreaking domestic service is a fascinating point of debate. Perhaps, for a very few, there was a fleeting sense of control, a small pocket of agency in a world that offered women so little. But even if that were true, it would have been a freedom bought at an incredibly high price, paid in reputation, health, and dignity. So, as you can see, the medieval landscape for prostitutes was far from idyllic. It was a gritty, often brutal existence, shaped by the physical constraints of overcrowded, unsanitary cities and the crushing weight of societal judgment. Their daily lives were a constant negotiation between survival and stigma, between the harsh realities of their environment and the even harsher realities of human prejudice. They were the shadows of the city, both indispensable and despised, and their struggle for existence in such conditions only compounded the already formidable challenges of maintaining any semblance of hygiene. You awaken, not to the refreshing scent of your favorite lavender shower gel, but to the pervasive, cloying air of a medieval morning. It's a scent that clings to everything. A thick tapestry woven from stale sweat, unwashed wool, damp earth, and the faint, unmistakable tang of human effluvia. Forget your daily rinse, your invigorating scrub, your carefully curated skincare routine. In the medieval world, bathing was less a hygienic ritual and more, well, an event. And for many, especially those eking out a living on the fringes of society, it was an event that happened about as often as a solar eclipse. Imagine, if you will, the sheer logistical nightmare of a full-body wash in medieval times. You don't just turn a tap. Oh no. First, you'd need to haul water, often from a communal well or a nearby river, bucket by laborious bucket. Then, you'd need to heat it, which meant gathering firewood, tending a fire, and waiting, all for a tub that might be little more than a wooden barrel, shared by multiple family members or, in the case of a brothel, multiple colleagues. It was an undertaking, an investment of time, labor, and precious fuel, making it a luxury rather than a necessity for most. It's no wonder that the idea of a daily shower would have been as alien to them as a smartphone is to a medieval knight. Though, to be fair, a knight might have appreciated the smartphone for ordering takeout after a long siege. This scarcity of personal washing meant that pervasive body odor wasn't just a mild inconvenience. It was the baseline. Your nose, accustomed to the fresh, clean air of modern life, would be utterly assaulted. Picture layers of smell, accumulating day after day, week after week. Sweat? Yes, but also the microscopic debris of dead skin cells, the oil from unwashed hair, the lingering scent of last night's meal, and the general grime of a world where dust and dirt were constant companions. For the medieval prostitute, whose livelihood depended on close physical proximity to others, this lack of bathing was a particularly cruel irony. Their bodies were their tools, yet they were forced to operate them in conditions that guaranteed discomfort and a constant, inescapable stench. You might try to imagine it, but your modern brain simply doesn't have the olfactory memory banks to truly grasp the depth of it. It's like trying to explain the concept of Wi-Fi to a pigeon. When bathing did occur, it was often a communal affair. Public bathhouses, sometimes known as stews or stuves, existed in many towns and cities. These weren't the serene, spa-like oases you might envision. Think more along the lines of a public swimming pool that hadn't seen a filter change since the last Crusades. The water, often murky and shared by numerous patrons, would quickly become a lukewarm soup of other people's dirt, sweat, and whatever else might have sloughed off. While the intention might have been cleanliness, the reality was often a breeding ground for skin infections and general unpleasantness. These establishments were often frequented by prostitutes, sometimes even operating as fronts for brothels, or at the very least, serving as meeting points where transactions were initiated. It was a place where bodies, clean or otherwise, mingled with abandon. Historians still argue whether the decline of public bathhouses in later medieval Europe was primarily due to changing social mores, religious condemnation, or simply the economic impracticality of maintaining them. Whatever the reason, their eventual disappearance in many areas only exacerbated the problem of personal hygiene. People resorted to dry bathing, which largely involved rubbing down with cloths, sometimes infused with herbs, or simply brushing off visible dirt. It was a bit like trying to clean a car by just blowing on it. Better than nothing, perhaps, but hardly effective. For the medieval prostitute, the implications of this communal and infrequent bathing were profound. Imagine the constant, intimate contact with numerous individuals, day in and day out, without the benefit of regular washing. Your skin, perpetually coated in its own effluvia and the remnants of countless encounters, would become a landscape of irritation. Rashes would be common, angry red patches blooming in the folds of the skin where sweat and friction conspired. Boils, those painful, pus-filled lumps, would erupt, a testament to clogged pores and bacterial infections. Impetigo, a highly contagious bacterial skin infection, would spread easily, manifesting as weeping sores and crusty lesions. And scabies, the relentless itch caused by microscopic mites burrowing under the skin, would be an ever-present tormentor, driving you to scratch until your skin was raw and broken. The constant friction from coarse, unwashed clothing, combined with sweat and dirt, would create prime conditions for chafing, particularly in sensitive areas. These abraded spots would then become open invitations for bacteria, leading to secondary infections that festered and refused to heal. You might find yourself constantly itching, a subtle, maddening torment that never truly went away, made worse by the knowledge that scratching only exacerbated the problem. It's a vicious cycle, where the lack of proper cleaning directly fed into a constant state of discomfort and potential illness. Think of it as a perpetual bad hair day, but for your entire body, and instead of just looking messy, you're actually slowly festering. Beyond the visible ailments, there was the pervasive, inescapable body odor. It wasn't just your smell. It was the accumulated scent of everyone you'd been near, every surface you'd touched, every unwashed garment you wore. The air in a medieval brothel would have been thick with this miasma. A potent cocktail of unwashed bodies, stale beer, cheap wine, and the faint, sweet, sickly smell of decay from minor infections. It would cling to your hair, your skin, your very pores, making it impossible to escape, even in sleep. You might try to mask it with strong perfumes or herbs, as we'll discuss later, but it would be like trying to hide an elephant behind a postage stamp. One particularly quirky historical tidbit is that some medieval medical texts actually advised against frequent bathing, believing it weakened the body or opened pores to disease. The logic, flawed as it was, suggested that the body's natural humors could be disrupted by excessive washing, leaving one vulnerable to illness. So, not only was bathing difficult and expensive, but some learned minds were actively advising against it. It's a bit like getting a memo from your doctor telling you that brushing your teeth is actually bad for your gums. The medieval prostitute, therefore, lived in a constant state of physical discomfort, their skin a battleground of rashes, sores, and itching. Their bodies, the very tools of their trade, were subject to a relentless assault of grime and infection, made worse by the nature of their work and the limited means available to them. The luxury of a simple bar of soap and clean running water, which you might take for granted every single day, was an unimaginable dream. Instead, they navigated a world where the very act of existing meant being perpetually grimy, a testament to a time when cleanliness was far from godliness and often far from achievable. Now, let your mind drift from the general griminess of medieval life and focus, if you can, on something even more intimately crawling. Imagine, if you will, the hair, not just a hairstyle, but the very state of hair itself across the medieval landscape. You see, the concept of washing one's hair with any regularity, certainly not with the daily lather, rinse, repeat rituals we take for granted today, was virtually non-existent. For most people, a proper hair wash might happen a few times a year, if that. It was a Herculean effort, requiring heated water, often from a large cauldron, and a significant amount of time and physical labor. Forget quick showers, this was an event. So you can picture it, can't you? Hair, regardless of social standing, accumulated layers of natural oils, dust from unpaved streets, soot from open fires, and the general detritus of daily life. For the vast majority, hair was often long, whether flowing freely or, more commonly, braided and tucked away under various head coverings like wimples, coifs, or hoods. These coverings, while serving purposes of modesty and fashion, also had a rather practical, albeit unacknowledged, function. They helped to contain the inevitable. And what, you might ask, was this inevitable companion? Yes, the ubiquitous louse, Pediculus humanus capitis, to be precise. These tiny, six-legged terrors were not just an occasional nuisance. They were a constant, itching reality for virtually everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the highest nobility, and yes, especially for the prostitutes whose lives we're examining. Think of it less as an infestation and more as a permanent, albeit unwelcome, residency. Your scalp, a bustling metropolis for these minuscule inhabitants. Imagine the persistent, maddening itch. It's not just a fleeting scratch. It's a deep, relentless irritation that accompanies you through every waking moment and, quite often, disturbs your sleep. You'd find yourself subconsciously reaching up, digging your nails into your scalp, trying to dislodge the tiny creatures or their even tinier, glue-like eggs known as nits firmly cemented to the hair shaft. These nits, by the way, are notoriously difficult to remove, even with modern fine-toothed combs. Back then, without specialized tools or effective chemical treatments, it was a losing battle. You might pull out a few, but thousands more remained, patiently waiting to hatch. It was a bit like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup, but the ocean was on your head and it liked to bite. The lack of regular hair washing was the primary culprit, of course. Water was often scarce, and even when available, it wasn't always clean. Soap, as we know it, was a luxury, if it even existed in a form suitable for hair. Most people would use ashlie or various herbal concoctions, perhaps some diluted vinegar, which might offer a temporary illusion of cleanliness but did little to dislodge the tenacious nits or truly eradicate the adult lice. It was more of a sprinkle and hope approach than a thorough cleanse. Some might try to comb their hair with rough wooden or bone combs, but these were crude tools, more for untangling than for effective nit removal. Now, consider the medieval prostitute. Her life was, by definition, one of close contact. She lived in crowded tenements or brothels, often sharing rooms, if not beds, with other women. Her profession brought her into direct, physical proximity with numerous individuals every single day. Each new client, each fellow resident, each person she brushed past in the bustling, narrow streets, represented a potential new source of infestation or reinfestation. It was a viral network, but for parasites. If one person had lice, everyone nearby was virtually guaranteed to acquire them. It was the ultimate medieval share economy, but the commodity was unwanted guests. Think about the sheer volume of lice that could accumulate. We're not talking about a discrete few. We're talking about hundreds, perhaps thousands, scurrying through the hair, feeding on blood, leaving behind tiny, irritating bites and excrement. The constant scratching would break the skin, leading to sores, scabs, and secondary infections. Imagine the scabs weeping, the hair becoming matted with blood and pus, all while the lice continued their relentless feast. It's a truly visceral image, isn't it? The smell, too, would be distinctive, a combination of unwashed hair, body oils, the faint metallic tang of dried blood, and perhaps the acrid scent of traditional herbal remedies attempting to repel the invaders. And it wasn't just lice. Fleas, though more commonly associated with clothing and bedding, would also readily take up residence in hair, especially if it was thick and unkempt. These tiny jumpers added another layer of torment, their bites leaving itchy red welts. It was a veritable ecosystem thriving atop your head. You were not alone even when you thought you were. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this pervasive issue is the widespread use of head coverings across all social strata in medieval Europe. While often attributed to modesty, religious strictures, or social status, these coverings, from the simple coifs of peasants to the elaborate wimples of married women, also served a practical purpose. They helped to keep unruly hair contained and, perhaps more importantly, to conceal the visible signs of infestation, the constant scratching, the nits clinging to strands, the sores. It was a way of maintaining a semblance of decorum when your scalp was a battleground. It was the original hat hair, but with a lot more going on underneath. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, consider some of the medieval cures for lice. Beyond simple combing, people would try a variety of concoctions. Strong vinegar was a popular choice, believed to loosen the nits. More extreme measures included applying mercury, yes, the toxic heavy metal, or hellebore, a poisonous plant, to the scalp. Some even resorted to fumigation, attempting to smoke out the parasites. You can just picture someone leaning over a smoking brazier, hoping to suffocate the lice before they suffocated themselves. It really puts our modern lice shampoo in perspective, doesn't it? Imagine explaining that to your doctor today. Yes, I tried the mercury, but the itching persists. The sheer universality of the problem meant that medieval society, to a certain extent, simply accepted it as a fact of life. It wasn't necessarily seen as a mark of extreme personal filth in the way we might perceive it today, because everyone had them to some degree. However, for prostitutes, the severity of the infestation would often be greater due to their living conditions and constant exposure, making their struggles with head lice even more pronounced. Historians still argue whether the perceived uncleanliness of certain groups, like prostitutes, was a primary cause of their infestations or merely an exacerbating factor in a world where everyone struggled with parasites. It's a chicken and egg question. Did they have more lice because they were seen as dirty, or were they seen as dirty because they had more lice? What is clear is that the close quarters of brothels, the shared bedding, and the intimate nature of their work created an ideal breeding ground for these parasites, ensuring that the cycle of infestation continued unabated. You couldn't escape it. Your hair, once a symbol of beauty or status, became a constant source of discomfort, a visible, if often hidden by coverings, testament to the unhygienic realities of the age. Now settle in because we're about to dive, perhaps a little too literally, into the rather pungent realm of medieval oral hygiene, or more accurately, the distinct lack thereof. Imagine, if you will, a world where the concept of a toothbrush as you know it simply doesn't exist. Forget your fancy electric sonic brushes, your fluoride toothpastes, your minty mouthwashes. We're talking about a time when the most sophisticated dental care you could hope for was a prayer and maybe, just maybe, a really sharp pair of pliers wielded by someone who usually cut hair or hammered metal. You see, in the medieval period, maintaining a sparkling white smile wasn't exactly a priority, nor was it even a possibility for most. The general population, from the highest lord to the lowest peasant, navigated life with teeth that were, by modern standards, in a state of perpetual decay. Their diet, heavily reliant on coarse grains, bread, and often high in natural sugars from fruits or honey, when available, provided a veritable feast for oral bacteria. There were no refined sugars in the sense we know them today, but the constant presence of starches and natural sweeteners meant plaque built up relentlessly. And without any effective means of removal, it just stayed there. So what did this mean for your average medieval person and, by extension, for the prostitutes we're focusing on? It meant a mouth that was a biological time capsule of every meal eaten, every sip taken, every cavity that had ever begun its insidious journey. You'd find teeth worn down to stumps, discolored by years of food and drink, often riddled with black holes, the telltale signs of rampant decay. Abscesses, those painful pockets of pus, would have been a common, agonizing reality, swelling gums and cheeks, making eating a torment and speaking a challenge. And the pain, oh, the pain! Without pain relief beyond perhaps a swig of ale or some dubious herbal concoction, a toothache wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a debilitating, life-stopping agony that could last for days, weeks, or even months until the tooth finally gave up the ghost and fell out, or was yanked out by a local barber surgeon. Imagine trying to charm a client when half your face is swollen like a melon and every word sends a jolt of agony through your jaw. Not exactly conducive to a thriving business, is it? And then there's the breath. Ah, the breath. Without daily brushing, flossing, or even rinsing with anything more potent than water, the accumulation of food particles, bacteria, and the byproducts of decay would have created an olfactory assault of truly epic proportions. We're talking chronic, pervasive halitosis that would make even the most seasoned modern dentist recoil. It wasn't just the occasional bad breath from an onion-laden meal. This was the deep, fundamental stench of a mouth in constant biological warfare. Think about the close quarters of medieval life, the lack of personal space, and the very intimate nature of a prostitute's work. This wasn't just an aesthetic issue. It was a constant, unavoidable sensory experience for anyone nearby. You could try to mask it with a sprig of mint or parsley, if you were lucky enough to get your hands on some, but it was like trying to hide an elephant behind a single leaf. A mainstream historical fact here is that medieval remedies for bad breath often included chewing on aromatic herbs like fennel or anise, or even rinsing with vinegar, desperate measures for a desperate problem. The problem extended beyond just the teeth themselves. Gum disease or periodontitis would have been universally present. Gums would have been inflamed, bleeding easily, and often receding, exposing the roots of the teeth. This chronic inflammation further contributed to the foul odor and the eventual loosening and loss of teeth. It's no wonder that by their 30s or 40s, many medieval individuals, including prostitutes, would have been missing a significant number of their teeth, if not most of them. Imagine the sight. A young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, whose smile is already a testament to the ravages of time and neglect, a mosaic of gaps and decaying stumps. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? The concept of preventative dental care was simply non-existent. People didn't understand the link between plaque, sugar, and decay. They might have attributed toothaches to toothworms, a common medieval belief that tiny worms burrowed into the teeth, causing pain. This quirky tidbit highlights the lack of scientific understanding. How do you fight a worm you can't see, let alone one that doesn't exist? Cures for these mythical worms ranged from fumigating the mouth with strange concoctions to applying poultices made of various herbs and even, in some rather extreme cases, ground-up mouse brains. Yes, you heard that right. Ground-up mouse brains. Suddenly, a little bad breath doesn't sound so bad. Does it? When a tooth became too painful or too loose, the only real option was extraction. And who performed these extractions? Not trained dentists, because that profession didn't exist in a specialized, regulated form. Instead, you'd turn to a barber, a blacksmith, or perhaps a traveling quack. Imagine going for a haircut and coming out with one less molar. These extractions were, as you can imagine, brutal affairs. No anesthesia beyond perhaps a strong drink, no sterile instruments, just brute force and a pair of pliers. Infection after extraction was a very real and terrifying possibility, often leading to sepsis and death. The idea of a dentist being a gentle, reassuring figure who offers you nitrous oxide is a truly modern miracle. For medieval prostitutes, a painful tooth was a direct threat to their livelihood and their life. If they couldn't work due to pain or severe disfigurement, their already precarious existence became even more perilous. The societal implications of such widespread poor oral health are fascinating. When everyone has bad breath and decaying teeth, does it become the norm? To a certain extent, yes. But for those in professions requiring close interaction, like prostitutes, the impact would have been more acutely felt. While clients might have been accustomed to the general stench of medieval life, a truly putrid breath or visibly decaying mouth could still be a deterrent. This is where the desperate attempts to mask odors with perfumes, which we'll touch on later, become even more poignant. It's a good thing perfume was so strong back then because, well, you get the picture. Historians still debate the true prevalence of specific dental diseases across different social strata, given the limited archaeological evidence from certain groups. While the general picture is clear, widespread decay and loss, the nuances of how diet and access to even rudimentary care, like a barber surgeon, might have varied. The severity remain a topic of ongoing discussion. But for the most vulnerable, like medieval prostitutes who often lived on the fringes of society with limited resources, it's safe to assume their oral health was among the worst. Think about the simple act of kissing. In a world where mouths were often festering with infection, where teeth were rotting and breath was foul, it takes on a whole new, rather unappealing dimension. It highlights just how different the sensory landscape of the past truly was. Your 30th birthday might just have been a tooth-losing competition rather than a celebration of youthful vitality. The constant discomfort, the chronic pain, the social stigma of a visible decay, and the ever-present stench emanating from within it paints a truly grim picture of just one aspect of medieval hygiene. And remember, this is just the mouth. We haven't even gotten to the rest of the body yet. Now, let's take a deep, slow breath and turn our attention to something even more intimate, something that clung to the body like a second skin, absorbing the very essence of medieval life: the undergarments. You see, while we might casually toss our briefs or socks into a hamper after a single wear, the concept of fresh, clean underthings was, shall we say, a bit of a luxury in the Middle Ages, especially for those inhabiting the grittier corners of society, like our medieval prostitutes. Imagine, if you will, a world where the idea of a daily change of clothes was as outlandish as a flying car. Your undergarments, typically a loose-fitting tunic-like garment called a chemise or shift for women, and braise, think baggy shorts, for men, were the very first layer against your skin. They were the unsung heroes, or perhaps the unsung martyrs of medieval hygiene. Their primary job wasn't just modesty. It was to act as a sacrificial barrier, absorbing the sweat, the oils, the dead skin cells, and all manner of bodily secretions before they could soil the more expensive and harder to clean outer garments. This meant they were, by design, destined to become absolutely filthy. The materials themselves tell a story. While wealthy individuals might have enjoyed fine linen, which was relatively smooth and absorbent, many would have worn coarser linen or even wool directly against their skin. Linen, even coarse linen, was generally preferred for undergarments because it was believed to be more absorbent and less irritating than wool, especially when it came to wicking away moisture. This mainstream historical fact about linen's prevalence for undergarments highlights a small nod towards comfort and absorbency, even if the washing part was largely neglected. Wool, though warm, was notoriously itchy, especially when damp with sweat, and would have been a constant source of discomfort. So you're already starting with a foundation that's either rough or, if linen, quickly becoming rough with accumulated grime. Now, let's talk about the washing, or rather, the distinct lack thereof. Laundry day wasn't a quick cycle in a machine. It was an arduous, full-day affair, requiring vast quantities of water, lye, derived from wood ash, and immense physical labor. Clothes would be boiled in large cauldrons, scrubbed, beaten with wooden paddles, and then rinsed, often in a nearby stream or river. This wasn't something you did every day, or even every week. For most people, especially the working poor and those living hand-to-mouth, it might happen only a few times a year. And for a prostitute, whose livelihood depended on their time and health, dedicating a full day to such an exhausting chore was simply not a viable option. Nor was it a priority when food and shelter were paramount. Ah, yes, you might hear someone quip, "My chemise is ripe for a good beating, or maybe just another month." So what happened to these seldom washed undergarments? They became a living tapestry of the body's output. Every bead of sweat, every tiny flake of dead skin, every drop of oil from the pores, every bit of dust and dirt picked up from the grimy streets, it all got trapped within the fibers. Over days, then weeks, then months, these layers would build up. The fabric would stiffen, becoming less pliable, more abrasive against the skin. You'd feel it clinging, chafing, and perhaps even crackling a little with accumulated salts and dried bodily fluids. It's like wearing the same gym clothes for a marathon, then a week of light workouts, then a month of just living in them. Now, add the medieval layer of general societal filth and you're getting closer. For prostitutes, the situation was compounded by the very nature of their profession. Beyond the sweat and grime of daily life, their undergarments would also absorb other bodily fluids: vaginal discharge, semen residue, and menstrual blood. Imagine the discomfort, the stickiness, the constant dampness. The fabric, once perhaps a pale, off-white linen, would quickly take on a mottled, stained appearance, a grim palette of yellows, browns, and faint reddish hues. And with that came the smell. Oh, the smell. It wasn't just a faint whiff of body odor. This was a deep, pervasive stench, a cocktail of stale sweat, sour oils, dried secretions, and the faint, unmistakable tang of ammonia from trapped urine vapors. The fabric would literally reek, a musky, earthy, slightly ammoniac aroma that would cling stubbornly to the wearer and permeate any enclosed space they occupied. It was the kind of smell that, even if you couldn't quite place it, you knew it wasn't good. It was the smell of human accumulation, of biological processes left unchecked, of fabric that had gone far beyond its intended purpose of absorbency and had become a repository of the body's grimy history. You could probably tell someone's entire hygiene routine just by giving their undergarments a good, long sniff, a medieval sniff test for the truly brave. The constant wearing of these soiled undergarments had profound effects on the skin. The perpetual dampness and friction, combined with the accumulation of bacteria and fungi, created an ideal breeding ground for all sorts of skin ailments. Rashes were common, as were chafing, boils, and fungal infections like ringworm or jock itch. The skin beneath these layers would often be irritated, red, and itchy, providing constant discomfort. It's a bit like wearing a permanent, unwashed bandage over large portions of your body, creating an environment ripe for infection and irritation. One quirky tidbit about these undergarments is that due to their constant wear and tear, and the lack of replacements, they were often patched and repaired until they were mere collections of rags. This wasn't about fashion or personal expression. It was about sheer necessity. A worn-out chemise would be repaired over and over, sometimes with fabric of a different color or texture, creating a patchwork testament to its long, arduous life. This practice underscores the preciousness of even these basic garments in a world where clothing was a significant investment. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for wearing undergarments was truly about personal cleanliness and comfort, or if it was more about protecting the more valuable outer garments from the body's effluvia. While they certainly offered a layer of warmth and modesty, their absorbency function was paramount, making them the first line of defense against the body's natural processes. This debate highlights the complex interplay between practicality, social norms, and the rudimentary understanding of hygiene in the era. Were they a form of hygiene by proxy, sacrificing themselves so the visible clothing remained somewhat presentable? Is food for thought. So, when you consider the medieval prostitute, clad in outer garments that were rarely washed, remember the layer beneath. The chemise or shift, stiff with dried sweat and bodily fluids, discolored, perhaps torn and crudely patched, emitting a low, persistent odor that no amount of perfume could truly mask. It was a constant companion, a second skin of grime, trapping the body's effluvia close, contributing significantly to the pervasive unpleasantness that defined their daily existence. It was a testament to a life lived on the fringes, where even the most basic elements of personal cleanliness were an unattainable luxury, and the very fabric of one's clothing became a historical record of every unwashed moment. Now, let's gently shift our focus from the general grime to something far more intimate, far more relentlessly personal: the crude and often agonizing methods of menstrual management in the medieval era. Imagine, if you will, being a woman in this period, facing a monthly reality that modern convenience has all but erased from our daily consciousness. For prostitutes, whose livelihoods depended on their bodies and their perceived allure, this was not merely an inconvenience. It was a profound, persistent challenge that touched every aspect of their existence. You see, the concept of disposable menstrual products, those marvels of modern engineering like tampons or adhesive pads, was utterly unimaginable. They might as well have been talking about flying chariots or personal teleportation devices. Instead, you would have relied on what was readily available, which usually meant scraps of fabric. Think about it. Old pieces of linen, wool, or even rough hemp, folded and tucked into your undergarments. These weren't designed for absorbency or comfort. They were simply what you had. Sometimes, if you were slightly more resourceful, or perhaps just desperate for a modicum of relief, you might try packing moss or dried herbs into these fabric pouches, hoping they'd offer a little extra absorption or perhaps a faint, earthy scent to counteract the inevitable. It's a bit like trying to stop a leaky faucet with a tea towel, isn't it? Not exactly a high-tech solution. The process of managing your period, then, was less about discrete changes and more about managing an ongoing, often messy situation. These fabric pads were, of course, reusable. You'd wear them until they were saturated, a sensation that would be utterly alien and profoundly uncomfortable to you now. Then you'd remove them, rinse them as best you could in cold, often murky water, if you even had access to a private basin, and then hang them to dry. And where would you hang them? Perhaps in a communal room or a cramped, damp corner of a brothel, where they would slowly, perhaps never quite fully, air out. The idea of soap, hot water, or any form of disinfectant for these items was largely a fantasy. So, you're constantly reintroducing bacteria to a sensitive area, setting the stage for a host of problems. Historians still debate the precise frequency with which these absorbent materials were changed, especially among the poorest women who might have owned only one or two such pieces, making constant reuse and limited drying time a grim reality. Now, let's talk about the sensory experience. Imagine the constant, clammy dampness against your skin, the chafing from rough, unwashed fabric rubbing against tender flesh with every step, every movement. It's an irritation that would build throughout the day, leaving your skin raw and vulnerable. And then there's the odor. Blood, even fresh blood, has a distinct smell. But when it's absorbed into fabric, held against a warm body, and allowed to sit, it begins to break down. Bacteria thrive in such conditions, producing a pungent, metallic, often sickly sweet stench that would cling to your clothes, your skin, and the very air around you. You might try to mask it with strong perfumes, if you could afford them, or perhaps tuck a sachet of dried lavender or rosemary into your bodice. But let's be honest, that's like trying to hide a barking dog with a whisper. The underlying reality was stubbornly present. It really makes you appreciate those little individually wrapped, scented products we have today, doesn't it? Back then, your best bet for a fresh feeling was probably a brisk walk in a strong wind, which, let's face it, wasn't exactly a practical solution in a bustling, crowded brothel. This constant dampness, friction, and bacterial presence created a fertile ground for discomfort and, more seriously, infection. Think about the prevalence of yeast infections, bacterial vaginosis, and urinary tract infections. These weren't just passing annoyances. They were chronic, debilitating conditions. Skin rashes and sores were common, and any break in the skin from chafing could become an entry point for more severe infections, especially with the general lack of understanding about germ theory. It's not hard to see how a simple monthly cycle could escalate into a serious health crisis for a woman with no access to proper medical care, let alone basic hygiene supplies. Beyond the physical discomfort, there was the immense social stigma surrounding menstruation. In medieval society, menstruation was often viewed as unclean, a curse of Eve, a sign of female impurity. Women were sometimes considered ritually impure during their menses, with superstitions claiming that their presence could sour wine, wither plants, or even cause bread to fail to rise. Imagine carrying that burden, that perceived uncleanness, on top of the physical reality of your period. And for prostitutes, who were already ostracized and considered morally unclean, menstruation simply reinforced society's judgment, deepening their existing social isolation. Some quirky beliefs even held that menstrual blood possessed potent, sometimes dangerous, magical properties, adding another layer of mystique and perhaps fear to a natural bodily function. Historians still debate the precise efficacy of the various herbal remedies or charms that women might have used for menstrual discomfort, or whether they were more for psychological comfort than actual physical benefit. For a prostitute, these challenges were amplified tenfold. Their work often involved constant movement, physical intimacy, and a need for a certain level of presentability, even if only superficial. How do you maintain an illusion of cleanliness, or even just avoid visible stains, when you're bleeding into a rough piece of cloth that's been rinsed in cold water and air-dried in a dirty room? The risk of leakage was ever present, a constant source of anxiety. Imagine the embarrassment, the potential for lost income, if a client noticed a stain. Discretion was paramount, yet virtually impossible to achieve. Furthermore, their limited resources meant fewer changes of cloth, less access to even rudimentary washing facilities, and virtually no privacy to manage their intimate hygiene. They couldn't simply retreat to a private bathroom for a discreet change or a quick wash. Their lives were lived in the open, in communal spaces, making dignity and personal comfort incredibly difficult to maintain. So, as you drift off, consider the incredible resilience of these women, navigating not just the harsh realities of their profession, but also the relentless, intimate struggle against the most basic biological functions, armed with little more than ingenuity and rough fabric. It's a stark reminder of how far we've come, and how much we often take for granted. As you drift through the grimy tapestry of medieval life, you start to notice the inescapable consequences of the hygiene habits, or severe lack thereof, that we've been exploring. It's not just about the smell anymore. It's about the body itself, constantly under siege. Imagine your skin, your very largest organ, as a battleground. In the medieval world, especially for those living in the close, often desperate circumstances of prostitution, that battle was rarely won. Diseases, both common and terrifying, were not just a possibility. They were an almost certain reality, thriving in an environment ripe with poor sanitation and intimate physical contact. Let's start with the skin, which, as you might recall, was rarely given the luxury of a good wash. Think of the constant itching, the persistent discomfort. You're not just dealing with the occasional mosquito bite, you're contending with a microscopic army. Scabies, for instance, was an absolute scourge. You wouldn't see the mites themselves, of course, but you'd feel their relentless presence. These tiny, eight-legged creatures burrowed into the top layer of your skin, laying eggs and leaving behind trails of their waste. The result? An intensely itchy, red, bumpy rash, often worse at night, driving you to scratch until your skin was raw and broken. And once you started scratching, you opened the door to secondary bacterial infections, turning an irritating rash into weeping sores. Given that you were sharing beds, sharing close quarters, and constantly in physical contact with others, scabies was practically a communal greeting card passed from person to person. It was just part of the background noise of life, like the constant drone of flies. Then there was impetigo, another delightful skin condition, characterized by red sores that quickly ruptured, oozed, and then formed a honey-colored crust. It's a bacterial infection, highly contagious, and it loved nothing more than skin that was already compromised by cuts, scrapes, or the incessant scratching from, say, scabies or lice. Imagine trying to maintain any semblance of allure when your face, hands, or other exposed skin were dotted with these unsightly, weeping lesions. You might call for a physician who would likely prescribe a poultice of pigeon droppings and vinegar. Because, nothing says healing like fermented bird waste. Truly groundbreaking medical science, right? If a medieval dermatologist were to open a practice, they'd have a waiting list longer than the king's banquet table, and every single patient would present with itching general. Talk about job security. But as unpleasant as those were, they pale in comparison to the dread that accompanied the arrival of certain venereal diseases. Without modern understanding of germ theory or, more importantly, antibiotics, these illnesses were devastating, disfiguring, and often deadly. The most infamous of these was undoubtedly syphilis, often referred to as the Great Pox or the French disease, depending on whose side you were on in the latest war. Naturally, this terrifying illness burst onto the European scene in the late 15th century with a virulence that shocked everyone. Historians still argue whether syphilis arrived in Europe with Columbus's sailors, a devastating import from the New World, or if it had been present in a milder form before the late 15th century, only to mutate into a far more virulent strain. Regardless of its exact origin, its impact was immediate and horrific. Imagine the stages. Initially, you might develop a painless sore, a chancre, often on the genitals, but sometimes in the mouth or elsewhere. Easy to ignore, easy to dismiss. Then, after a few weeks or months, a widespread rash would appear, often affecting the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet, sometimes accompanied by fever, swollen glands, and hair loss. Perhaps you'd develop mucus patches in your mouth or throat, making eating and speaking painful. This was the secondary stage, highly contagious, and incredibly distressing. If left untreated, which in the medieval period it almost always was, because there was no effective treatment, the disease would then enter a latent stage, seemingly disappearing for years, even decades. But syphilis was a patient killer. It would re-emerge in its tertiary stage, utterly grotesque and debilitating. You might develop large, destructive lesions called gummas, which could appear anywhere on the body, on the skin, in bones, in internal organs. Imagine the disfigurement. Noses collapsing, bones decaying, skin erupting in ulcers. Beyond the physical decay, syphilis could also attack the nervous system, leading to blindness, deafness, paralysis, dementia, and even madness. For a medieval prostitute, whose livelihood depended on her physical presentation and mental faculties, syphilis was a death sentence delivered by slow, agonizing degrees. The very act of earning a living became the means of acquiring a horrifying end. And syphilis was just one of the venereal diseases making the rounds. Gonorrhea and chlamydia, though not always differentiated or understood as distinct diseases in the medieval mind, were certainly prevalent. You'd experience burning during urination, discharge, and pain. While perhaps not as overtly disfiguring as syphilis in its later stages, these infections could lead to chronic pain, infertility, and severe complications if left untreated, which, again, they were. For women, untreated gonorrhea or chlamydia could cause pelvic inflammatory disease, leading to excruciating abdominal pain, abscesses, and permanent damage to the reproductive organs. The constant cycle of infection, reinfection, and lack of effective treatment meant that many suffered from a cocktail of these ailments, their bodies ravaged from the inside out. The sheer intimacy of the profession, combined with the utterly non-existent understanding of disease transmission, created a perfect storm. You were in constant close contact, not just physically, but often sharing bedding, towels, if they existed, and even drinking vessels. There was no concept of barrier methods, no understanding of how a disease could pass from one person to another through bodily fluids. For centuries, the prevailing belief wasn't that tiny, invisible creatures were making you ill, but rather that bad air, a noxious miasma, was creeping through the streets, carrying sickness on its foul breath. So, while you might be covered in scabies, the real worry was that whiff from the overflowing latrine next door. Priorities, right? The lack of hand washing, which we'll delve into more deeply later, played a crucial role too. Imagine touching a lesion then touching a doorknob or preparing food, or simply touching another person. The chain of transmission was unbroken, the cycle of infection perpetual. And remember, these women often lived in poverty, their diets meager, their bodies weakened by frequent pregnancies, miscarriages, and the general hardships of their lives. A weakened immune system is a welcoming host for any pathogen looking for a new home. You were not only exposed to constant infection, but your body was often ill-equipped to fight it off. So, while you might try to mask the foul body odors with strong perfumes, there was no disguising the telltale sores, the rashes, the general air of ill health that permeated the lives of medieval prostitutes. Their bodies became living maps of the era's medical ignorance and sanitary neglect. Imagine trying to explain germ theory to someone whose best medical advice involved leeches. You'd probably get a blank stare, and then they'd suggest bleeding you for good measure. It's just bad humors, dear, not tiny invisible creatures, they'd say. Oh, the enlightenment that awaited centuries later. The rampant spread of venereal diseases and skin conditions wasn't just a matter of discomfort. It was a constant, visible reminder of the brutal realities of their existence, etching itself onto their very flesh. As you trudge through the narrow, winding streets of a medieval town, your senses are assaulted by an olfactory symphony that would make even the most seasoned modern-day urbanite recoil. It's a complex bouquet, a pungent tapestry woven from stale refuse, animal droppings, and the undeniable, omnipresent reek of human waste. You might imagine a subtle hint of lavender or rose from some distant garden, but alas, it's mostly just eau de medieval street. And a significant contributing factor to this pervasive aroma, this thick, almost tangible atmospheric layer, is the truly haphazard and often shockingly public disposal of human waste. Forget everything you know about modern plumbing, about the discreet flush of a toilet, about underground pipes whisking away waste to treatment plants far, far away. In the medieval era, such conveniences were the stuff of fantastical dreams, or perhaps nightmares if you imagine the pipes bursting. Instead, you're navigating a world where personal hygiene, as we understand it, was a foreign concept and public sanitation was, frankly, an oxymoron. Let's talk about latrines. When they existed, they were often communal affairs, rudimentary structures that offered little in the way of privacy or, more importantly, effective waste management. Picture a wooden bench with several holes cut into it, often situated over a cesspit or, if you were lucky, directly over a flowing river or moat. These were the public conveniences, and the word convenience is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. You'd share these facilities, not just with other people, but with the accumulated waste of countless previous users. The stench alone would be enough to make your eyes water, a thick, cloying miasma that clung to the air, promising an intimate acquaintance with every previous visitor's digestive output. The concept of cleaning these spaces was, shall we say, a low priority. They were typically overflowing, attracting swarms of flies that buzzed with an almost aggressive enthusiasm, and their contents often seeped into the surrounding ground, polluting the very earth you walked on. It was less a place of relief and more a monument to collective human effluvium. But public latrines were only part of the problem. For most people, most of the time, the chamber pot was the primary receptacle for human waste. Every household had one or several. You'd wake up, attend to your morning necessities in the privacy or semi-privacy, depending on the household size and layout of your own room, and then what? Well, that's where things got truly interesting and truly disgusting. The contents of these chamber pots, often referred to as night soil, had to go somewhere. And more often than not, that somewhere was the street outside. Imagine this. You're walking down a narrow, cobblestone lane, perhaps admiring a particularly gnarled timber-framed house, when suddenly, with a splash and a splat, a torrent of human waste rains down from an upper window. This wasn't an uncommon occurrence. In many towns, it was a regular, accepted method of waste disposal. You might hear a shouted warning, like, "Garde-à-l'eau," a corruption of the French gardes l'eau, meaning watch out for the water. But often, the warning came too late. It was a literal shower of human effluent, and dodging it became a practiced art form. You'd learn to walk closer to the buildings, or perhaps develop a keen ear for the telltale splash. It was a daily game of human waste dodgeball, played with real, uncomfortably warm, and very smelly steaks. If you think your municipal trash collection is slow, try waiting for the next rainstorm to cleanse the streets. This brings us to the streets themselves, which effectively functioned as open sewers. The cobblestones, uneven and unmaintained, were often trenched with gutters designed to carry away rainwater. But these gutters, lacking any proper gradient or connection to an actual sewer system, became stagnant channels for all manner of refuse, including the ubiquitous human waste. They were sluggish rivers of filth, thick with feces, urine, discarded food scraps, and whatever else found its way onto the street. The air above them shimmered with flies, and the putrid stench was so overpowering that it seeped into your clothes, your hair, and seemed to cling to your very skin. You couldn't escape it. It was the pervasive background hum of medieval life. This haphazard disposal wasn't just unpleasant. It was a public health catastrophe waiting to happen, and often actively happening. The direct dumping of waste attracted an absolute carnival of vermin. Rats, plump and bold, scuttled through the gutters and across doorsteps, feasting on the organic matter. Flies buzzed in thick clouds, landing on everything, from the food in market stalls to the open sores on people's skin, carrying invisible payloads of disease with every step. You couldn't swat them all away, no matter how vigorously you tried. They were an ever-present, buzzing reminder of the unsanitary conditions. And it wasn't just rats and flies. Cockroaches, beetles, and other crawling insects thrived in the damp, decaying filth, making themselves at home in every crack and crevice. The accumulation of this waste created truly putrid environments. Imagine the smell of an old, uncleaned public toilet, then multiply that by 1,000 and spread it across an entire town, bake it under the summer sun, and mix in the aroma of decaying organic matter. That's closer to the reality. The ground itself was often saturated with human and animal waste, turning pathways into treacherous, slippery, and deeply unhygienic quagmires, especially after a rain shower. You couldn't avoid stepping in it. It was simply part of the landscape, and for those who worked and lived on the streets, like many prostitutes, this was their constant reality, their daily backdrop. Their contact with this filth was unavoidable, not just through walking, but through the general air, the surfaces they touched, and the very ground they stood on. Mainstream historical fact time. Medieval cities, even major ones like London or Paris, lacked sophisticated, widespread underground sewage systems for domestic waste. While some Roman-era sewers might have existed in older cities, they were often neglected or repurposed. The primary method for dealing with human waste in most medieval towns was indeed the cesspit, a deep, unlined pit dug beneath a latrine or house, designed to collect waste. These cesspits would fill up and then, periodically, someone had to empty them. This led to the rather unenviable, but critically important profession of the gong farmer, or night soil man or raker. These individuals, often working under the cover of darkness to avoid the worst of the stench and public scrutiny, would literally shovel out the contents of cesspits, load them onto carts, and transport them outside the city walls, often to be used as fertilizer on fields. It was a job with a terrible smell, a low social status, and a high risk of disease, but someone had to do it. And a quirky tidbit for you: while many castles had garderobes, latrines, that emptied directly into the moat or a river, some castles also had chutes that led to a midden heap at the base of the wall. This was, in a strange twist of medieval ingenuity, sometimes seen as a defensive measure. Imagine trying to assault a castle wall while being showered with, well, you get the picture. It certainly wasn't a pleasant experience for besieging armies, adding a very unchivalrous layer to warfare. It was the original bioweapon, perhaps, or at least a very effective deterrent against climbing. The medieval equivalent of a no loitering sign, perhaps, but with a much more visceral impact. Now, historians still argue whether medieval city planners and authorities genuinely understood the direct link between this pervasive waste and the spread of devastating diseases like the plague or dysentery. While they certainly recognized that filth was unpleasant and could attract vermin, their understanding of germ theory was non-existent. Their efforts at sanitation were often more driven by a desire for order, a reduction of foul smells, which they associated with bad air or miasma, and perhaps a basic sense of civic pride, rather than a scientific understanding of pathogens. They knew bad smells were bad, but didn't quite grasp why they were so bad beyond the immediate sensory assault. They'd often issue edicts against dumping waste, not because they understood bacteria, but because it made the streets impassable or simply looked and smelled terrible. The sheer volume of waste, combined with the lack of effective disposal systems, meant that medieval towns were fundamentally, deeply unsanitary places. The air was thick with the stench, the ground was perpetually soiled, and the constant presence of vermin was just a given. For prostitutes, whose lives were often lived in the grimiest parts of these towns, in close quarters, and with constant physical contact with others, these environmental factors compounded the personal hygiene challenges. The very air they breathed, the streets they walked, the beds they slept in all were permeated by the pervasive, putrid legacy of human waste. It wasn't just about what they did or didn't do personally. It was about the world they inhabited, a world where the very concept of cleanliness, as we know it, was a distant, unreachable star. It was a truly grimy existence, where the battle against filth was a losing one, fought daily against an overwhelming tide of everything. And this constant exposure to raw sewage, to the breeding grounds of disease, created a baseline level of health risk that is almost unimaginable to us today. Now, as your eyelids grow heavy and the world outside fades into a soft hum, let's transport ourselves to the very place where respite should be found, but often wasn't: the medieval bed. Imagine, if you will, the sleeping quarters within a medieval brothel. You won't find crisp, clean sheets or plush memory foam here. Oh no. Instead, you'll likely encounter a communal space, perhaps a few rough wooden frames, or even just straw laid directly on the floor. And upon these rudimentary sleeping arrangements, a veritable ecosystem thrived, unseen but undeniably felt. You see, the medieval bed, especially in an establishment like a brothel, was less a sanctuary of rest and more a vibrant, nocturnal buffet for the smallest, most unwelcome guests. We're talking about a world teeming with vermin, a constant, irritating presence that made true, undisturbed sleep a luxurious, almost mythical concept. The bedding itself, often just straw or a coarse fabric mattress, was rarely, if ever, truly cleaned. Think about it. No washing machines, no hot water on tap, no understanding of germ theory. Cleaning might involve dragging the straw out into the sun on a rare warm day, perhaps beating it with a stick to dislodge some of the larger debris. But for the microscopic multitude, this was merely a temporary inconvenience, if that. The primary culprits in this nightly assault were, of course, fleas. Ah, the humble flea. These tiny, dark specks, barely visible to the naked eye, were the undisputed champions of medieval pestilence. They didn't just infest animals. They loved humans, too, especially those in close quarters with others, and those whose bedding was a permanent fixture for weeks or months on end. You'd lie down, tired to your bones, and almost immediately you'd feel them. A sudden, sharp prick, then another and another. It's like 1,000 invisible needles, all trying to get a taste of you. And the itch that followed? Persistent, maddening, driving you to scratch until your skin was raw and inflamed. These fleas, you see, were remarkably prolific. A single female flea could lay dozens of eggs a day, which would then hatch into larvae that fed on organic debris, like the skin flakes and dried blood that accumulated in undisturbed bedding. Then they'd pupate, emerging as adult fleas, ready to jump onto their next warm-blooded host. It was an endless cycle, a biological merry-go-round of irritation. You might try to brush them off, but their powerful legs could launch them an astonishing distance relative to their size, making them infuriatingly difficult to catch. It's like trying to catch a particularly enthusiastic popcorn kernel in midair, only this popcorn kernel bites back. And then, lurking in the cracks of the wooden bed frames, behind loose wallpaper if there was any, and within the very seams of the mattresses, were their equally unwelcome cousins, the bedbugs. Unlike fleas, which are more agile jumpers, bedbugs are stealthy crawlers, emerging from their hidden lairs under the cover of darkness. They are nocturnal vampires, truly, waiting for you to settle into a deep sleep before they embark on their feast. Their bites are often painless at first, thanks to an anesthetic in their saliva, which means you might not even realize you're being bitten until you wake up the next morning covered in itchy, red welts, often arranged in telltale lines or clusters. Imagine waking up, not refreshed, but already battling an invisible army. Your skin, a roadmap of tiny, raised bumps, each one a testament to the night's unwelcome visitors. The more you scratch, the more the itching intensifies, and soon, what were mere bites become open sores, perfect entry points for secondary infections. In a world without antibiotics, even a simple scratch could become a serious problem. It's truly a marvel how anyone managed to get any restorative sleep under these conditions. You'd probably spend half the night slapping at yourself, muttering curses into the stale, vermin-scented air. Mainstream historical fact time. It's widely documented that fleas were not just a nuisance, but a significant vector for disease in medieval Europe, most notoriously the bubonic plague. While the plague's primary vector was often the rat flea, human fleas and bedbugs certainly contributed to the general unsanitary conditions that allowed diseases to flourish. So, while these little biters were making your night miserable, they were also silently participating in a much larger, more terrifying biological drama. The shared nature of the bedding in brothels only compounded the issue. Multiple occupants, night after night, meant a constant influx of new hosts for the pests and a continuous replenishment of the food source. It wasn't just fleas and bedbugs either. While the primary focus is on those that feasted on occupants, lice from unwashed hair could easily migrate to bedding, and other crawling insects like mites would undoubtedly have been present. The straw mattresses themselves, rarely changed, became a breeding ground for all manner of microscopic life, a dusty, organic soup of discarded skin, sweat, and insect detritus. It's enough to make you itch just thinking about it, isn't it? Quirky tidbit alert. Medieval folks weren't entirely helpless against these tiny terrors, though their methods were often more folk remedy than effective science. One common practice was to hang bunches of strong-smelling herbs like lavender, mint, or wormwood around beds, believing their pungent aromas would deter insects. Some even stuffed these herbs directly into mattresses. While these might have offered a fleeting, aromatic distraction from the stench of stale bodies, their actual effectiveness against determined fleas and bedbugs was minimal at best. It's a bit like trying to stop a charging rhinoceros with a feather duster, a valiant effort, but ultimately futile. The sheer sensory experience of sleeping in such conditions would have been overwhelming. The constant, subtle rustle of straw as you shifted, the faint, acrid smell that hinted at unseen life, and the persistent, crawling sensation that made your skin prickle even when nothing was actually there. Your imagination, fueled by exhaustion and irritation, would play tricks on you, turning every shadow into a scurrying rodent, every faint sound into the whisper of 1,000 tiny legs. Historians still argue whether the psychological toll of this constant nocturnal assault was as debilitating as the physical discomfort. Was the lack of truly restorative sleep a significant factor in the general health and resilience of medieval people, especially those whose lives were already incredibly taxing? It's hard to quantify, but one can only imagine the cumulative effect of years of interrupted, itchy sleep. You'd be perpetually tired, your nerves frayed, making the already harsh realities of daily life even more challenging to face. And let's not forget the simple lack of dignity. To be constantly bitten, to wake up covered in welts, to know that your sleeping space was a living, breathing microcosm of filth. It would chip away at one's sense of self, reinforcing the social stigma already heaped upon medieval prostitutes. Their bodies, already exploited, were further invaded and consumed by these unseen forces, even in the supposed privacy of their beds. It was a constant reminder of their precarious existence, a literal skin-deep manifestation of their societal marginalization. So, as you drift off tonight in your clean, pest-free bed, perhaps with a freshly laundered duvet and a plush pillow, spare a thought for those in the medieval past. Their nights were not for peaceful slumber, but for a nightly battle against an unseen, unrelenting enemy. The beds in medieval brothels were not havens of rest, but rather hotbeds of irritation, discomfort, and disease, painting a truly vivid, if somewhat itchy, picture of a deeply unhygienic past. It really makes you appreciate modern pest control, doesn't it? I mean, who needs a lullaby when you have the soothing hum of a vacuum cleaner? And so, we arrive at the outer layer, the final frontier of medieval hygiene, or rather, the lack thereof. Imagine, if you will, the clothes that were worn not just for a day, but for weeks, months, perhaps even years without the benefit of a proper wash. This wasn't merely a fashion statement. It was a living, breathing testament to the challenges of the age, particularly for those whose lives were lived on the grimy edges of society. You're not just putting on a garment. You're donning a second skin, one that carries the history of every encounter, every spilled ale, every drop of sweat, and every particle of street dust. Think about the fabrics themselves. Wool, rough and durable, was a common choice, especially for outer cloaks and tunics. Linen, though softer, was often reserved for undergarments. But even then, it faced the same fate of infrequent washing. These natural fibers, while perhaps more breathable than modern synthetics, were also incredibly absorbent. They drank in the humidity of the air, the dampness of the crowded taverns, the greasy residue from food, and, most intimately, the constant perspiration of the body. Each thread became a tiny sponge, soaking up the effluvia of daily life, holding onto it with a tenacious grip that defied the most casual attempts at cleaning. Now, when we say rarely washed, we're not talking about a missed laundry day here and there. We're talking about a fundamental difference in the concept of cleanliness. For most people, and especially for those in the lower echelons of society like prostitutes, washing clothes was an arduous, time-consuming, and resource-intensive endeavor. You didn't just toss things into a machine with a scented pod. Oh no, you needed access to a water source, often a river or a public well, which could be far away. Then you needed lye or urine, yes, urine, often collected and aged, for its ammonia content to act as a rudimentary detergent, which could be harsh on the skin and the fabric alike. Then came the beating, the scrubbing, often against a stone, followed by rinsing and the slow air-drying process. It was a full-day affair, a back-breaking chore that was simply not feasible to undertake with any frequency, especially when survival itself was a daily struggle. So, your outer garments, the ones that were meant to present you to the world, slowly but surely transformed. What did this accumulation look like? Well, picture a garment that has absorbed layers upon layers of existence. The original vibrant dyes, if there ever were any, would have long since faded, replaced by a dull, uniform grayness or a muddy brown, stained with dark patches where sweat had repeatedly saturated the fabric, particularly under the arms, at the collar, and across the back. You might see the telltale streaks of dried mud from the unpaved streets, or the greasy sheen from spilled food and drink. The fabric itself would lose its softness, becoming stiff and coarse, almost like a piece of cardboard, from the dried grime embedded within its fibers. It would have a particular matted quality, where the individual threads were no longer distinct but fused together by compacted dirt and body oils. And the smell? Ah, the smell. This is where the sensory details truly come into their own. It wasn't just a smell. It was a symphony of odors, a complex bouquet of human existence that clung to the very fibers of the clothing. There was the sour tang of old sweat, not the fresh, sharp scent of recent exertion, but the deep, fermented aroma of sweat that had dried and re-dried countless times. This mingled with the musty dampness that permeated everything in medieval living spaces, especially in humid conditions or after a sudden downpour. Add to that the acrid notes of wood smoke, which clung to clothes like a second skin from hearth fires and street vendors. Then you'd detect the faint, cloying sweetness of stale alcohol, the sharp hint of spilled urine from the streets, and the earthy, animalistic odor that came from constant contact with animals and the general muck of the urban environment. It was a persistent, all-encompassing miasma that announced your presence long before you were seen. You could try to air it out, perhaps hang it on a line on a rare sunny day, but the core of the stench was deeply ingrained, a part of the fabric's very being. It was the kind of smell that, once it got into your nose, seemed to settle there, a permanent resident. It's a curious thing to consider, isn't it? We live in a world where we can change our clothes daily, even multiple times a day, and wash them with powerful detergents that promise mountain-fresh scents. In the medieval period, Your clothes were almost an extension of your body, accumulating the dirt and smells of your life like rings on a tree. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this is the sheer value placed on clothing. Garments were expensive, often representing a significant investment, sometimes even passed down through generations. They were repaired, patched, and worn until they literally fell apart. This economic reality further contributed to their infrequent washing. You wouldn't risk damaging such a valuable asset with harsh cleaning methods unless absolutely necessary. There's even a quirky tidbit about this. Some records suggest that when a person died, their clothes were often among the most valuable items to be bequeathed or sold, even with their accumulated grime. Imagine inheriting a tunic that carried the essence of its previous owner, not just in sentiment but in scent. It really puts our modern sensibilities into perspective. You can almost hear someone in a medieval market haggling over a cloak, saying, "But look, it still has the original owner's patina," a very unique kind of vintage indeed. This constant accumulation of filth on outer garments also played a role in the spread of pests. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs, which we discussed earlier as infesting beds, didn't just stay put. They hitched rides on clothing, finding warm, dark crevices within the folds of unwashed fabric. A simple brush past someone wearing such a garment could mean a new infestation for you. It was a mobile ecosystem of microscopic life, thriving in the warmth and the organic matter trapped within the fibers. You might even find yourself scratching an itch and wondering, is it me? Or is it my coat? The answer, more often than not, was probably both. Historians still argue whether the distinct, often brightly colored, clothing mandated for prostitutes in some medieval cities was intended to highlight their social status and make them easily identifiable, or if the very nature of their profession and living conditions meant that their clothes would inevitably become distinctive through their grimy state, regardless of initial color. Perhaps it was a combination of both, with the law simply formalizing an already visible reality. In any case, that vibrant red or yellow tunic, meant to mark you, would quickly become a dulled, stained, and most certainly fragrant beacon in the crowded, smelly streets. The overall effect was one of perpetual unkemptness, a visual and olfactory statement that reinforced their position on the fringes of society. It was a smell that clung, not just to the fabric, but to the perception of the individual, a silent, pervasive judgment. You've been with us now through the murky waters of medieval hygiene, or rather, the distinct lack thereof. You've imagined the rarely bathed skin, the matted, lice-ridden hair, the breath that could fell a small animal, and the perpetually soiled underthings. You've even had a peek into the brothel beds, crawling with unseen guests. By now, your own modern nose might be twitching, trying to conjure the truly overwhelming symphony of smells that would have permeated every street, every room, and every person in medieval times. It was, to put it mildly, a lot. And for those in professions requiring close contact, like our medieval prostitutes, this pervasive, inescapable stench presented a rather significant occupational hazard. So, what did one do when faced with an olfactory assault of such magnitude? Well, if you were living in the medieval period, and especially if your livelihood depended on proximity to others, you did what any resourceful human would do: you tried to mask it. You attempted to build a fragile, aromatic shield against the tide of unpleasantness. Imagine, if you will, a faint, almost desperate whisper of rosewater trying to shout over a roar of stale sweat, unwashed wool, and something vaguely reminiscent of a forgotten cheese rind. The methods employed were varied, ranging from the truly luxurious and expensive, often reserved for the nobility, down to the more humble and readily available. But even the lower echelons of society, like our prostitutes, would scrimp and save or receive as payment whatever small aromatic luxuries they could get their hands on. Their very livelihood depended on presenting some semblance of appeal, and while beauty standards were different, a truly overwhelming personal miasma was unlikely to attract repeat clientele. Unless, of course, your clientele also smelled equally robust. It was a symbiotic relationship of shared olfactory challenges. Let's talk perfumes. Not the delicate, multi-layered concoctions we know today, but robust, often single-note powerhouses. The most coveted ingredients were those derived from animals, believed to possess incredible fixative properties and a certain carnal allure. you'd find civet, extracted from the glands of the civet cat, a musky, almost fecal aroma when undiluted, but surprisingly alluring when heavily diluted and blended. Then there was musk, from the musk deer, similarly potent and earthy. And, perhaps most intriguing, ambergris, a waxy substance found in the digestive system of sperm whales, which, after floating in the ocean for years, develops a sweet, earthy, marine scent. These were not for the faint of nose, nor for the light of purse. A prostitute might dream of such exotic essences, but they were likely far beyond her reach. Perhaps a tiny, almost microscopic dab, gifted by a particularly generous, or perhaps particularly desperate patron. More commonly, and certainly more accessible, were perfumes derived from plants. Rosewater, for instance, was a mainstream historical fact of medieval perfumery. Distilled from rose petals, it offered a delicate, if often overwhelmed, floral note. You'd also encounter lavender, rosemary, mint, and a range of spices like cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg, all ground down and mixed with oils or fats to create rudimentary balms or pomades. These weren't just for smelling nice. Some were even believed to have medicinal properties, warding off illness through their strong aromas, aligning with the prevalent miasma theory of disease. The idea that bad smells literally made you sick. So, if you smelled like a rose garden, surely you couldn't get the plague, right? It was a charming, if utterly incorrect, thought. These aromatic substances weren't typically splashed onto the skin with abandon, as modern perfumes are. Firstly, they were too precious. Secondly, medieval skin, already contending with a host of issues, might not have reacted kindly to concentrated, unrefined essences. Instead, they were often applied to clothing, to hair, or used to impregnate small sachets or sweet bags that could be tucked into bodices or hung from belts. Imagine a small linen pouch, perhaps embroidered, filled with dried lavender, rose petals, and maybe a few crushed cloves. It's a quaint image, isn't it? A tiny, fragrant oasis clinging to a garment that hasn't seen soap and water in weeks, perhaps months. It's like putting a single air freshener tree in a car that hasn't been vacuumed since the last millennium. It's not really doing the job, but bless its little cotton heart for trying. Then there were pomanders. These were, in essence, medieval air fresheners, carried on one's person. The simplest form was an orange studded with cloves, a quirky, fringe tidbit that still pops up around Christmas today. The citrus oils combined with the spicy cloves to release a pleasant, if temporary, aroma. More elaborate pomanders were beautiful, often spherical containers made of precious metals like silver or gold, perforated with small holes. Inside, they held various aromatic substances: ambergris, civet, musk, or blends of spices and herbs, often mixed with a binder like beeswax. You'd carry it, perhaps on a chain, and occasionally bring it to your nose for a refreshing sniff. For a prostitute, a simple orange pomander might be a luxury, a sign of a slightly better day, a fleeting attempt to conjure an illusion of freshness. Imagine the contrast. A woman, her clothes grimy, her hair matted, but clutching a clove-studded orange like a talisman against the omnipresent funk. It's a poignant image of desperate optimism. The burning of incense was another common practice, especially in brothels or wealthier homes. Frankincense and myrrh, ancient resins with deep, woody, often spiritual aromas, would be burned, filling the air with their potent smoke. This wasn't just for masking odors. It was also thought to purify the air and ward off evil spirits or disease. So, you'd have the lingering, cloying sweetness of incense layered over the heavy, sour notes of unwashed bodies and stagnant air. It was a multisensory experience, to say the least. It's like trying to cover the smell of a dumpster fire with 1,000 scented candles. You just end up with a dumpster fire that smells vaguely of vanilla. But here's the rub, the fundamental flaw in this aromatic strategy. These were all attempts to mask, not to clean. They were surface solutions to deep-seated problems. You could douse yourself in rosewater, tuck sweet bags into every fold of your garment, and carry a pomander, but the underlying stench, the stale sweat, the bodily fluids, the decaying teeth, the unwashed hair, the persistent grime, it was all still there. The perfumes and herbs simply added another layer to the complex olfactory tapestry. Historians still debate the true efficacy of these medieval masking agents, questioning whether they genuinely improved social interactions or merely created a new, complex olfactory experience. Did patrons genuinely find these women more appealing? Or did they simply become accustomed to the bizarre blend of strong perfume and underlying human musk? It's hard to say definitively. Perhaps it was less about making someone smell good and more about making them smell less bad, or at least differently bad. For a prostitute, this daily ritual of applying scents was a futile battle against an invisible enemy. It was a constant, often expensive, endeavor to make herself presentable, to attract and retain clients, in a world where true cleanliness was almost impossible to achieve. She might spend what little money she had on a precious vial of rosewater, hoping its delicate fragrance would somehow cut through the pervasive odors of her daily life. She knew deep down it was a losing fight, but she fought it nonetheless, a small act of defiance against the grimy reality of her existence. It was a testament to the human desire for pleasantness, even in the most unpleasant of circumstances. And you can almost hear the sigh of resignation as she applied another dab, knowing full well it was just a temporary truce in the war against the medieval funk. Now, let's turn our attention to one of the most fundamental, yet utterly absent practices of personal hygiene in the medieval era, and particularly for those living on the fringes of society, hand-washing. Imagine, if you will, a world where the very concept of microscopic germs causing disease was as alien as a spaceship landing in the town square. It simply wasn't understood. People lived, ate, worked, and interacted with hands that were, to put it mildly, perpetually filthy. You see, for us, the idea of washing our hands after using the restroom, before eating, or after touching something grimy is ingrained from childhood. It's a public health mantra, drilled into us by countless campaigns featuring animated soap bubbles and catchy jingles. But for the medieval individual, especially a prostitute navigating the rough and tumble streets and brothels, such a notion would have been utterly nonsensical. Why bother? Water was often a precious commodity, laboriously fetched from a well or river, and primarily reserved for drinking, cooking, or perhaps a very infrequent communal bath. Soap, while it existed, was a harsh, lye-based concoction, often expensive and primarily used for laundry, not for the delicate task of routinely scrubbing one's skin. So, the act of washing hands, as we know it, was simply not a part of daily life. Consider the sheer amount of direct, physical contact in a prostitute's day. You're not just interacting with one or two people. You're meeting dozens, if not more, each with their own unique blend of street grime, body odor, and potential contagions. Your hands are your primary tools of interaction, touching skin, clothing, rough fabrics, and the occasional coin. And let's be honest, medieval currency was less a symbol of economic exchange and more a mobile petri dish, passed from hand to hand, picking up whatever delightful microbial passengers came along for the ride. You'd handle these coins, perhaps count them out, then without a second thought, reach for a chunk of bread or a piece of cheese. No quick rinse, no wipe, just straight from the grimy coin purse to your mouth. It's enough to make your modern, sanitized stomach churn, isn't it? The implications of this pervasive lack of hand hygiene were, quite literally, sickening. Think about it. Every time you scratched an itch, rubbed your eyes, or touched your mouth, you were effectively inoculating yourself with whatever delightful collection of bacteria, viruses, and parasites had accumulated on your skin. And if you happened to have a small cut or scrape, which, given the rough nature of medieval life, was more common than not, those unwashed hands became a direct conduit for infection. Skin infections like impetigo or erysipelas, which caused painful, red sores, would have been rampant, exacerbated by the constant reintroduction of bacteria from unwashed hands. It's a grim cycle. An itch leads to a scratch, which breaks the skin, which gets infected by the very hands that scratched it. A truly vicious circle, wouldn't you say? The most insidious consequence, however, was the silent, invisible spread of gastrointestinal diseases. Dysentery, often referred to as the bloody flux, was a common and terrifying killer in the Middle Ages. Cholera-like illnesses, typhoid, and various parasitic worm infestations were also prevalent. These diseases are primarily transmitted via the fecal-oral route. And what facilitates that route more effectively than hands that have just handled human waste, directly or indirectly, and then come into contact with food or drink? Imagine the public latrines we discussed earlier, overflowing, putrid, swarming with flies. You would use such facilities, perhaps wipe yourself with a handful of straw or a piece of moss, and then nothing. No washing, no sanitizing. Just back to your daily tasks, your hands now carrying a fresh payload of pathogens. Then you might prepare a meal, perhaps for yourself or for others in the brothel. You'd need dough, chop vegetables, or stir a pot, all with hands that had just been in contact with potentially infectious material. It's like a medieval public health nightmare, playing out daily in every home, every inn, every brothel across the land. It almost makes you want to invent a time machine just to bring them a bottle of hand sanitizer. Though, to be fair, they might try to drink it. This wasn't just a problem for prostitutes, of course. It was a societal issue. But for those in constant, intimate contact with numerous individuals, the risk was exponentially higher. You're not just touching your own contaminated surfaces, you're touching everyone else's. This constant cross-contamination created a perfect breeding ground for disease. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most profound, yet they remained undiscovered for centuries. A mainstream historical fact that underpins this entire discussion is the pervasive lack of understanding of germ theory. For centuries, illness was attributed to miasma, bad air, or imbalances in the body's humors, or even divine punishment. The idea that tiny, invisible creatures could cause sickness was revolutionary, only truly gaining traction in the 19th century with the work of scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. Before then, the link between dirty hands and disease was simply not made. It wasn't ignorance out of malice, but out of a fundamental void in scientific understanding. They simply didn't know what they didn't know. Can you imagine living in a world where the very air felt suspicious, but the grime on your hands was just normal? Now, for a quirky tidbit, while thorough hand-washing wasn't a thing for hygiene, there were some rudimentary practices that looked like hand-washing but served a different purpose. For instance, among the wealthier classes, it was common to have basins of water, sometimes scented with rose water, offered to guests before a meal. But this was more about etiquette, a symbolic cleansing to remove the dust of travel, than a germ-conscious scrub. It was a gesture of refinement, not a medical precaution. You'd dip your fingers, perhaps, but it wasn't about lathering up and scrubbing for 20 seconds. It was more like a quick spritz of fancy room spray for your hands. And speaking of scholarly debates, historians still argue whether the perceived uncleanliness of certain social classes directly correlated with their actual disease rates, or if other factors like diet and living conditions were more dominant. While it's clear that poor hygiene, including unwashed hands, contributed significantly to disease transmission, teasing out the exact impact compared to, say, malnutrition or overcrowded housing, remains a complex challenge for scholars. It's like trying to untangle a medieval knot. Every thread seems to lead to another equally grimy one. The constant battle against pests, which we'll discuss shortly, also contributed to the hand-borne spread of disease. You'd swat at a fly, crush a flea, or perhaps even handle a dead rat that had met its end in the brothel. All of these interactions would leave residues on the hands, which, you guessed it, would then be transferred to whatever you touched next. It's a cascading effect of griminess, each layer building upon the last. So, when you picture the medieval prostitute, consider not just the visible grime on her clothing or the stench of stale sweat, but the invisible world teeming on her hands. Every touch, every meal, every interaction was a potential vector for illness, a silent, unseen exchange of pathogens. It's a stark reminder of how far we've come in our understanding of health and disease, and how something as simple as a bar of soap and running water can be a revolutionary tool for public well-being. It truly paints a picture of a past where clean hands were not just a luxury, but an almost entirely unimagined concept. You've already had a glimpse into the constant, unwelcome companions that shared medieval living spaces, but now, let's truly settle into the overwhelming reality of the pest problem. Imagine, if you will, that every surface, every shadow, every quiet corner of your world is not just dirty, but alive. Not in a charming Disney animated forest kind of way, but in a squirming, scuttling, biting, disease-carrying kind of way. This wasn't an occasional nuisance. It was an ever-present, relentless, and often futile war against a myriad of tiny invaders. You try to drift off to sleep, perhaps, but the sounds are undeniable. The soft rustle in the straw of your mattress, the faint scratching behind the wainscoting, the tiny, almost imperceptible thump as something drops from the ceiling onto the floor. These weren't just the sounds of a house settling. They were the sounds of a thriving, multi-legged, multi-furred ecosystem sharing your most intimate spaces. Let's start with the big hitters, or rather, the small, furry, and surprisingly intelligent ones. Rats and mice. These weren't your cute, lab-bred companions. These were the grizzled veterans of the urban jungle, sleek with street grime and emboldened by centuries of human complacency. They were everywhere. You'd see them scurrying across the floor in broad daylight, bold as brass, darting into crevices, or even, most unsettlingly, peeking out from behind a loose floorboard with tiny, beady eyes that seemed to hold an ancient, knowing cynicism. Their presence wasn't just an aesthetic problem. It was a fundamental threat to existence. They gnawed through food stores, contaminating precious grains and dried meats with their droppings and urine. Imagine trying to keep any food safe when these furry saboteurs could chew through almost anything. Your meager supper, already a struggle to acquire, was constantly under siege. And it wasn't just food. They'd chew through textiles, ropes, even the very timbers of the building, creating new entry points for themselves and their friends. It was like living in a house with 1,000 tiny, furry burglars, except they also left behind biohazards. And then, of course, there's the undeniable, horrifying link between these rodents and disease. While the direct transmission of the Black Death from rat to human via fleas is a complex epidemiological story, the general understanding that rats carried pestilence was certainly part of the medieval consciousness, even if they didn't grasp the mechanics. It's a mainstream historical fact that the sheer density of rat populations in medieval cities, particularly in areas with poor sanitation and close human habitation, significantly contributed to the rapid spread of various diseases, including the devastating bubonic plague. You couldn't escape them. They were in the sewers, the markets, the kitchens, the bedrooms, constant, silent partners in the dance of death. Moving on from the furry fiends, let's talk about the buzzing, crawling, and biting multitude that made up the insect population. If you thought rats were bad, imagine millions of tiny, winged, or multi-legged horrors. We've touched on lice and fleas before, but here you truly appreciate the struggle against them. It wasn't just an itch. It was a constant, maddening irritation. You'd scratch and scratch and scratch, but the relief was fleeting. These creatures were so pervasive that they were simply an accepted part of life. You'd see people casually picking lice from their hair or clothes, or even from each other, in public. It was the medieval equivalent of checking your phone for notifications, just a lot itchier and less productive. And then there were the bed bugs. Oh, the bed bugs. Given the shared, rarely cleaned bedding in brothels, these nocturnal vampires thrived. You'd lie down, exhausted after a long day, perhaps hoping for a moment of peace, only to become a buffet for these tiny, blood-sucking parasites. Their bites would leave itchy welts, often in telltale lines, and the constant irritation would disrupt sleep, leading to fatigue and further weakening an already compromised immune system. It was a vicious cycle. Poor hygiene led to more pests, which led to more bites, which led to more discomfort and less sleep, which led to even less energy for maintaining any semblance of cleanliness. It was like trying to relax in a vibrating bed that also occasionally took a small sample of your blood, and you couldn't turn it off. Flies, too, were omnipresent. With open sewers, overflowing latrines, and general waste everywhere, flies buzzed in a constant, droning symphony. They landed on everything. Your food, your skin, your eyes, the open sores on your body. Each landing was a potential transfer of pathogens, a tiny, six-legged vector depositing the filth of the streets directly onto your person. You swat at them, but it's like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup. For every one you managed to shoo away, 100 more seemed to appear, drawn by the irresistible scent of medieval urban life. Oh, look, a fresh batch of disease vectors. You might sigh, as a particularly corpulent fly lands squarely on your untouched bread. Just what I needed for breakfast. And cockroaches, scuttling shadows, were the silent, resilient inhabitants of every crack and crevice. They thrived in the damp, dark, and dirty conditions, emerging at night to scavenge. You might not see them as often during the day, but you knew they were there, a vast, unseen army lurking behind the walls, ready to reclaim the space once darkness fell. So, how did people battle these ever-present pests? The answer, for the most part, was with a profound sense of futility and a few rather quaint, often ineffective methods. Cats were certainly kept, and a good mouser was a prized possession. But even the most dedicated feline couldn't stem the tide of an entire rat population. Traps were rudimentary, snares and basic cages. Poisons, when available, were often crude and dangerous to humans as well. For insects, people tried various herbal remedies. Strong-smelling herbs like lavender, mint, and wormwood were strewn about or stuffed into mattresses, not just for their scent, but in the hope that their pungent aroma would deter fleas and other bugs. You might try to fumigate a room by burning herbs or even sulfur, creating a choking smoke that would hopefully drive out or kill some of the pests, but it was a temporary measure, and the pests would inevitably return. It was like trying to solve a leaky roof by constantly holding a bucket under it, except the bucket was also made of a slightly less leaky roof, and the roof was also actively trying to eat your bucket. A quirky tidbit from the era reveals that some medieval texts even describe methods for exorcising pests, believing that infestations could sometimes be attributed to demonic influence or ill will. So, alongside their rudimentary traps and herbs, people might also resort to prayers, blessings, or even specific rituals to rid their homes of unwanted guests. Imagine trying to convince a particularly stubborn rat that it's been spiritually evicted. Begone, foul rodent, by the power of this slightly damp piece of sage. The sheer scale of the problem meant that any individual effort felt like bailing out a sinking ship with a thimble. The constant itching, the fear of bites, the gnawing sounds, the sight of vermin, it all contributed to a pervasive sense of unease and a grim acceptance. It was a constant, low-level war, fought every day in every home, and for the most part, the pests were winning. This unending struggle had profound implications for health. Every rat, every flea, every fly was a potential vector for disease. They carried bacteria, viruses, and parasites from the filth of the streets directly into living and sleeping areas, ensuring that illnesses spread with frightening efficiency. The poor hygiene we've discussed, combined with this relentless pest infestation, created an environment where disease wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. And here's where we stumble into a fascinating point of contention. Historians still argue whether the primary vector for certain medieval diseases, beyond the obvious rat-flea link for plague, was truly the direct contact with filth and human fluids, or if the sheer proliferation of these animal and insect vectors played an even more significant role in the day-to-day spread of common illnesses like dysentery and typhus. It's a chicken and egg situation. Did the poor hygiene create the perfect breeding ground for pests, or did the pests, in turn, make hygiene almost impossible to maintain? Likely both, in a grim, self-reinforcing loop. So, as you finally close your eyes, you don't just feel the weight of a long day, but the invisible, crawling weight of an entire ecosystem sharing your space. The faint scritch-scratch behind the wall, the phantom itch on your arm, the low hum of flies outside the window, these were the lullabies of the medieval night. The battle against pests was not just about comfort. It was about survival, a constant, often losing fight against the tiny, relentless armies that sought to reclaim every inch of human habitation. Now, as our grimy journey nears its end, we arrive at perhaps the most potent, most pervasive aspect of a medieval prostitute's existence: the crushing weight of stigma. It's a concept that wraps around them like a shroud woven from judgment and societal disgust, a direct consequence of the very real, very palpable uncleanliness we've been exploring. You see, in the medieval mind, physical filth and moral depravity weren't just parallel concepts. They were often seen as inextricably linked, two sides of the same coin, each reinforcing the other in a vicious, inescapable cycle. Imagine, if you will, walking down a narrow, bustling medieval street. The air is thick with the usual medley of wood smoke, animal dung, and human effluvia. But then, a figure approaches and something shifts in the atmosphere. It's not just the sight of their often worn, rarely washed garments, perhaps visibly soiled from days or weeks of wear, clinging to skin that hasn't seen a proper wash in just as long. It's not just the faint, yet distinct odor that wafts from them. A complex bouquet of stale sweat, unwashed hair, the lingering scent of cheap perfumes attempting a valiant, yet ultimately futile battle against the underlying stench, and perhaps even the telltale sourness of poorly managed menstruation or the acrid tang of untreated sores. No, it's more than that. It's the perception of these things, amplified by a society that had already condemned their profession. You see the way people subtly shift their weight, perhaps turning their heads or pulling their children closer. There's a widening of the path as they pass, an unspoken agreement to maintain a safe, sanitary, and moral distance. This isn't just about avoiding a potentially contagious cough or the general unpleasantness of a crowded street. It's about avoiding contamination of a deeper, more spiritual kind. The physical squalor, the visible signs of disease, the persistent odors, these were not merely unfortunate circumstances of their poverty and lifestyle. To the medieval mind, they were often viewed as outward manifestations of inner corruption, a physical reflection of a soul steeped in sin. It was as if their very bodies were broadcasting their moral failings, a constant, silent sermon on the wages of sin. Forget your modern hand sanitizer. Medieval society had its own version of anti-prostitute spray, though it was less about germs and more about judgment, liberally applied through averted gazes and whispered condemnations. This perception of uncleanness was weaponized by society, serving as a powerful tool for ostracization. Prostitutes were, by definition, outside the social norm, often living on the fringes of acceptable society, sometimes even literally confined to specific districts or red light areas known as stews or brothel quarters. These areas, already prone to poor sanitation due to overcrowding and neglect, became further stigmatized as places of both physical and moral decay. You wouldn't find a respectable person willingly lingering there, unless, of course, they had an ulterior motive they wished to keep hidden. One of the most striking examples of this enforced stigma comes in the form of sumptuary laws, a mainstream historical fact that beautifully illustrates the medieval obsession with visual categorization and control. Across Europe, in cities like Paris, London, and many German towns, prostitutes were legally compelled to wear specific articles of clothing or colors that instantly marked them out. Imagine, for instance, a woman forced to wear a yellow veil in Florence, or a striped hood in Germany, or even, in some places, small bells sewn onto their clothing, jingling with every step, announcing their profession and their perceived moral standing to anyone within earshot. This wasn't about fashion. It was about public shaming and immediate identification. It ensured that there was no mistaking who they were, no accidental mixing with decent folk. It was a constant visual reminder of their perceived filth, both corporeal and spiritual. It's almost comical, isn't it? The same society that turned up its nose at a prostitute's grime was probably sporting its own impressive collection of bodily effluvia under its finery. The only difference was the official stamp of respectability, a kind of invisible medieval Febreze, if you will. This enforced visibility meant that ostracization was not just a social convention, it was a legal mandate. Prostitutes were often barred from participating in mainstream civic life. They couldn't join guilds, hold public office, or even, in many cases, attend church services alongside the virtuous. If they were allowed into churches at all, it was often in a segregated section, lest their moral and physical pollution taint the sanctity of the congregation. They were denied the right to marry, to inherit property, or even to testify in court against a respectable citizen. Their word held little weight, their existence barely acknowledged outside the narrow confines of their profession. This wasn't just about physical distance. It was about stripping them of their humanity in the public eye, reducing them to mere vessels of sin and disease. Now, for a slightly more quirky or fringe tidbit, the depth of the stigma sometimes extended to superstitious beliefs about the very essence of their being. There were whispers in some communities that even a prostitute's shadow could bring bad luck, or that their gaze could defile a pure object or person. This wasn't just about the transmission of physical ailments like syphilis or scabies, which were very real concerns. It was about a perceived spiritual contagion. The idea was that their moral degradation was so profound that it literally emanated from them, capable of polluting the air they breathed and the ground they walked upon. You might hear tales of shopkeepers quickly wiping down counters after a prostitute had touched them, not just for practical cleanliness, but for a ritualistic cleansing against an invisible stain. Imagine the swipe left rate on medieval Tinder, if such a thing existed. It wouldn't just be about bad photos. It would be about the faint whiff of unwashed linen and spiritual damnation, compounded by the fear of a defiling shadow. The constant barrage of this profound, pervasive judgment surely took its toll. While we can't definitively know the inner thoughts of every medieval prostitute, one can only imagine the internalized stigma, the despair, or perhaps, for some, a defiant resilience born of necessity. To be constantly marked, constantly judged, to be seen as literally and figuratively unclean, must have been an immense psychological burden. It created a self-reinforcing cycle. Their marginalized status often forced them into environments where hygiene was almost impossible to maintain, which in turn reinforced the societal perception of their uncleanliness, further justifying their ostracization. It was a trap, meticulously constructed by social prejudice and economic reality. This brings us to a fascinating point of scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the intense focus on prostitutes' physical uncleanliness was a genuine public health concern, or merely a convenient, tangible manifestation of deeply ingrained moral prejudice used to justify their systemic marginalization. Was the dirt and disease the primary reason for the stigma, or was the stigma the reason people focused so intently on their dirt and disease, using it as a convenient scapegoat for broader societal anxieties? It's a chicken and egg scenario, where the grimy reality and the moral condemnation fed each other, creating an almost impenetrable wall of prejudice around these women. In essence, the medieval prostitute existed in a liminal space, physically present but socially absent, their very bodies serving as a canvas for society's fears and judgments. Their perceived uncleanliness, a potent blend of the genuinely unhygienic and the morally condemned, served as the ultimate tool for their marginalization. It was a narrative designed to keep them separate, to remind everyone, and perhaps most cruelly, themselves, of their place at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. As our journey through the grimy underbelly of medieval hygiene draws to a close, you find yourself standing at the precipice of understanding, looking back at a past so profoundly different from your own. It almost feels like a fever dream. You've trudged through the muck and mire, smelled the unwashed masses, and felt the phantom itch of unseen parasites. Now, we reflect on the enduring legacy of these hygiene challenges, painting a vivid, albeit pungent, picture of a truly grimy past. The conditions we've explored, the infrequent bathing, the perpetually soiled garments, the rampant vermin, and the crude disease management, weren't just isolated incidents of discomfort. Oh no, they were the very threads woven into the fabric of daily life, particularly for those on the fringes, like the medieval prostitute. The lasting impact of this pervasive uncleanliness rippled outwards, affecting not just individual health but the very structure and perception of medieval society itself. Imagine, if you will, the constant, debilitating drain on health. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages was, by modern standards, shockingly low. While famine, warfare, and childbirth certainly played their part, the incessant battle against infectious diseases, fueled by abysmal hygiene, was a silent, relentless killer. You see the skin infections that never quite healed, festering into chronic sores. You picture the internal ailments, from digestive woes to the more insidious venereal diseases, slowly but surely eroding the body from within. For the medieval prostitute, whose very livelihood depended on close physical contact, this constant exposure meant a life often cut tragically short, punctuated by pain and persistent illness. It wasn't just a matter of discomfort. It was a matter of survival, or more accurately, a struggle against an inevitable decline. And consider the societal repercussions. The medieval city, with its overflowing latrines and haphazard waste disposal, was a breeding ground for epidemics. The lack of understanding about germ theory meant that people literally lived, worked, and died in a petri dish of their own making. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is how the very density and unsanitary nature of medieval urban centers, combined with constant movement of people, including merchants, pilgrims, and yes, prostitutes, created perfect conditions for widespread outbreaks. Think of the Black Death, for instance. While not solely a hygiene issue, its devastating spread was undeniably exacerbated by the general filth and close quarters of medieval life. Diseases didn't just stay within a brothel's walls. They hitched rides on unwashed hands, on flea-ridden clothes, and on the very air itself, sweeping through populations with terrifying speed. It's like a medieval game of hot potato, but instead of a potato, it's a virulent strain of dysentery, not quite as fun. The social stigma surrounding prostitutes was, as we touched upon, deeply intertwined with this perceived and very real uncleanliness. You see how the physical grime became a moral one. They were not merely seen as sinful, they were seen as literally unclean. This perception reinforced their ostracization, pushing them further to the margins of society, often into the very grimy districts where sanitation was at its worst. This created a vicious cycle. Poor hygiene led to illness and outward signs of disease, which then fueled the social stigma, which in turn limited their access to any nascent forms of care or better living conditions. It's almost as if society was saying, "You're dirty, so we'll make sure you stay dirty." A truly charming medieval welcome wagon. This enduring legacy of grimy living also shaped the slow, painful evolution of public health. While medieval people certainly weren't thinking about public health initiatives, in the modern sense, the sheer scale of disease and the overwhelming stench of their cities must have, on some level, spurred incremental changes over centuries. The development of more organized waste removal systems, the eventual understanding of contagion, and the later establishment of public health boards in early modern times can all be seen as a direct response to the unbearable conditions of the medieval past. It was a long, slow learning curve, like trying to teach a cat to fetch, but eventually, some progress was made. A quirky tidbit that illustrates this slow shift is the persistence of dry cleaning methods well into later centuries, where clothes were beaten or aired out rather than truly washed with water and soap, highlighting how deeply ingrained the fear of water or the sheer labor of washing was. Even when bathing became more fashionable in certain circles, it was often a luxury, not a daily necessity, and the widespread adoption of regular personal hygiene as we know it today was still centuries away. Imagine trying to explain daily showers to a medieval person. They'd probably think you were trying to drown them, or perhaps that you were just terribly, terribly odd. Historians still argue whether the perceived moral failings of prostitutes were genuinely a cause of their marginalized hygiene, or if their marginalized status forced them into conditions where poor hygiene was unavoidable. It's a classic chicken or egg scenario, isn't it? Was it their sinful nature that made them dirty, or was it the dirty conditions they were confined to that made them seem more sinful? Regardless of the precise causal link, the outcome was the same. A population of individuals living in profoundly unsanitary conditions, battling constant illness, and facing deep-seated societal prejudice. So, as you step back from this vivid, visceral journey into the medieval past, you gain a profound appreciation for the simple act of turning on a faucet, for the miracle of soap, for the luxury of clean clothes, and for the absence of fleas in your bed. The medieval world, particularly for those on its fringes, was a place where the fight for cleanliness was a losing battle, a perpetual struggle against an environment determined to keep you grimy. It was a world where bad smells were simply part of the air you breathed, where persistent itching was just a fact of life, and where the threat of disease was an ever-present shadow. This enduring legacy of a grimy past isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a stark reminder of how far humanity has come in understanding and managing its own health and environment. It underscores the incredible advancements in sanitation, medicine, and public health that we often take for granted. You realize that your comfortable, clean bed, your freshly washed pajamas, and the very air you breathe, free from the stench of human waste and decaying teeth, are not just modern conveniences, but the culmination of centuries of slow, arduous progress away from a truly, truly grimy past. Now, as the last echoes of those medieval streets fade, and the phantom smells begin to dissipate, you can feel the warmth of your own clean sheets, the softness of your pillow. The clamor of the past grows distant, replaced by the gentle hum of your own quiet space. Let the lingering images of those challenging times soften, transforming into a deep appreciation for the comforts of your present. Feel the coolness of the air, the gentle rise and fall of your breath, as your mind begins to drift, letting go of the grime, embracing the calm. Allow your thoughts to settle, like dust motes dancing in a soft, fading light, slowly, gently, coming to rest. The stories are told, the history absorbed, and now it's time for peace.